Clint Eastwood walked into court alone, facing a skeptical judge and a smirking lawyer. They expected an actor. What they got was a man who knew exactly how to win. The Santa Barbara County Courthouse was unusually crowded that morning, its grand wooden benches packed with reporters, spectators, and curious locals whispering among themselves. Outside, a row of news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, ready to broadcast what many believed would be a spectacle rather than a trial. The air inside buzzed with anticipation, not for some high-profile criminal case, but for something far more unexpected. Clint Eastwood, at 94 years old, was standing at the plaintiff's table representing himself. Across the room, Richard Lancaster, a powerful real estate developer in his mid-50s, sat at the defense table, his tailored suit pristine, his expression smug. He had built a luxury resort expansion on a plot of land that, as Clint claimed, was never his to build on. Lancaster had ignored cease and desist letters, dismissed legal warnings, and assumed that no one, not even a Hollywood legend, would stand in his way. He had seen men like Clint before, old, stubborn, relics of a past generation who still believed in honor and handshakes. They were easy to outmaneuver, easy to silence. This would be no different. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Thomas Whitmore adjusted his glasses, eyeing Clint with a mix of curiosity and amusement. In his early 60s, Whitmore was sharp, experienced, and known for his dry humor. He had presided over countless property disputes, but none had ever featured a movie star turned legal advocate standing alone against a team of high-powered attorneys. The judge cleared his throat and gave a wry smile. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench, "I assume you know this isn't a Western." A ripple of laughter moved through the gallery, some chuckles louder than others. Even Samuel Porter, Lancaster's lead attorney, smirked, shaking his head as if to say, "This will be easier than I thought." The press took notes furiously, knowing this opening moment alone would make headlines. Cameras, though not allowed in the courtroom, were already waiting outside to capture whatever drama would inevitably spill out onto the courthouse steps. Clint, however, remained unshaken. His blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, held steady on the judge. He stood tall, his presence commanding yet composed. He had walked into plenty of rooms where people underestimated him. He had heard the laughter before. It never bothered him then, and it wouldn't bother him now. He let the moment stretch just a little longer than necessary, a trick he had mastered in his decades on screen. The silence forced people to lean in, to wait, to wonder what he might say next. Then, with the measured ease of a man who had seen it all, Clint placed a neatly bound case file onto the table, tapping the top page lightly. His voice, deep and deliberate, cut through the lingering amusement in the room. "Justice isn't about theatrics, Your Honor. Let's get to the facts." The laughter died instantly. Judge Whitmore's smirk faltered, and a subtle shift rippled through the courtroom. For the first time, the room seemed to absorb what was happening. Not the absurdity of a famous actor trying to play lawyer, but the possibility that Clint Eastwood actually knew what he was doing. The air grew heavier, the whispers stopped, and even Lancaster's smirk tightened into a thin line. Across the room, Samuel Porter crossed his arms, studying Clint for the first time, truly studying him. He had walked into this trial expecting to dismantle an old man with legal jargon and dismissive gestures, but the way Eastwood stood there, the weight of his presence, the complete lack of hesitation in his tone, something about it unsettled him. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as easy as he thought. Laughter still lingered in the courtroom, though it was already beginning to fade. A few chuckles echoed from the gallery, some people exchanging amused glances as if to say, "Can you believe this old man thinks he can handle a legal battle on his own?" Even Judge Thomas Whitmore, despite his years of experience maintaining a neutral presence, couldn't quite keep the smirk off his face. The press, seated toward the back, scribbled furiously in their notepads, already composing the headlines in their minds. Clint Eastwood, Hollywood cowboy, takes on the law, or perhaps something even more biting, like a fistful of legal trouble, Eastwood's courtroom gamble. Across the room, Richard Lancaster, the wealthy developer who had encroached on Clint's land, reclined slightly in his chair, one arm draped over the back, his fingers tapping lazily against the polished wood. He exchanged a quiet remark with his lead attorney, Samuel Porter, a well-groomed man in his late 40s, known for his ability to talk circles around even the toughest opponents. Porter, adjusting his pristine navy blue tie, didn't bother lowering his voice as he spoke. "Well," he murmured, just loud enough for a few people nearby to hear, "I suppose we'll find out whether a Hollywood education holds up in a courtroom." Another ripple of laughter followed, quieter this time, but no less condescending. The moment was almost cinematic, Clint standing alone, a lone gunslinger against a room full of critics who had already decided his fate. Yet he didn't move, didn't react, didn't so much as blink. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He waited. Years spent in front of the camera had taught him the value of silence. A well-timed pause could shift the energy of a scene, could force the audience to lean in, waiting, anticipating, not even realizing they were holding their breath. And so, Clint Eastwood, standing in a courtroom that had already dismissed him, simply let the weight of the moment stretch. The murmurs died down. The smirks wavered. Even Judge Whitmore, perhaps realizing that Clint wasn't as rattled as expected, cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. And then, finally, Clint moved. Deliberately, without any wasted motion, he reached for the neatly bound case file resting on the plaintiff's table. The sound of paper against polished wood was quiet, but in the hushed courtroom, it might as well have been a gunshot. He didn't rush. He didn't fumble. He simply flipped open the first page, then the second, tapping a single finger against a highlighted paragraph before lifting his gaze. His voice, deep and steady, carried across the room, firm without being raised. "Justice isn't about theatrics, Your Honor. Let's get to the facts." The last remnants of laughter died instantly. Judge Whitmore's smirk vanished. Porter, his arms still crossed, narrowed his eyes slightly. Even Lancaster, still lounging in his chair, straightened just a fraction of an inch, as if suddenly aware that he might have miscalculated. Clint didn't stop there. With the same deliberate ease, he picked up a set of aerial photographs, holding them up for the court to see. The images, taken over several years, showed the untouched stretch of land he had legally owned since 1992. Then came the next set of photographs. Lancaster's luxury resort expansion creeping over the property line, inch by inch, year by year, an undeniable visual of encroachment. Clint's voice never wavered. These photographs document the land before and after Lancaster's construction began. The permits he obtained did not, at any point, grant him legal access to my property. He slid the images forward. I've also provided copies of the zoning laws he violated, the cease and desist letters that were ignored, and correspondence between my representatives and his legal team. All of it shows a pattern, one that proves beyond a doubt that my land was stolen. No one was laughing anymore. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his fingers laced together, his eyes scanning the documents laid out before him. The amusement was gone now, replaced by something else. Something that looked very much like respect. Across the room, Porter exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie again. The casual arrogance he had displayed moments earlier had been replaced by careful calculation. He was beginning to realize that Clint Eastwood hadn't come into this courtroom unprepared. He hadn't arrived expecting his name alone to carry weight. He had done the work. He had studied, and worse, he was proving to be a man who knew exactly how to command a room. Lancaster, meanwhile, said nothing at all. His fingers had stopped drumming against the table. The slight smirk that had curled at the corner of his lips had vanished entirely. Clint turned to the jury, his hands resting lightly on the plaintiff's table. He didn't need theatrics. He didn't need dramatic speeches. He had spent decades portraying men who stood for justice, who fought against corruption, who refused to be bullied into silence. But this time, it wasn't a script. It was real. "This is a matter of law," he said simply, "and the law is clear." The room remained silent. Judge Whitmore exhaled through his nose, flipping through a few more pages of Clint's evidence before speaking again. His tone was different now, not dismissive, not condescending, but measured, respectful. "Very well, Mr. Eastwood," he said, tapping his gavel lightly. "Proceed." In that moment, the tide had shifted. The laughter had stopped. And for the first time since Clint had stepped into that courtroom, everyone was taking him seriously. The courtroom, once filled with smug laughter and dismissive glances, now sat in tense, expectant silence. Clint Eastwood stood at the plaintiff's table, calm, methodical, unwavering. No longer just a Hollywood icon defending himself in a legal battle. He was a man on a mission, armed not with a script or a film crew, but with hard evidence, undeniable facts, and the kind of quiet authority that demanded attention. Every eye in the room was on him now, not because of his fame, but because he had proven he wasn't here to be mocked. He was here to win. Without a word, Clint reached into the neatly organized file before him, retrieving aerial photographs taken over several years. He held the first image high enough for the jury, the judge, and even the defense to see. A clear, untouched stretch of land in Santa Barbara County, land he had legally owned and maintained since 1992. Then, with the same measured precision, he placed another photo beside it, this one taken after Richard Lancaster's development had begun. The once pristine property line had been breached, overtaken by the creeping edges of a luxury resort expansion. The contrast was undeniable. Clint's voice, low and firm, carried effortlessly across the silent courtroom. "This is my land," he stated, his weathered fingers tapping the first image. "And this," he continued, moving to the second, "is what happened when Mr. Lancaster decided property laws didn't apply to him." The jury, who had initially seemed entertained by the prospect of watching an actor fumble his way through legal proceedings, leaned in now, their eyes darting between the images. The weight of Clint's statement hung in the air, each photograph reinforcing what should have already been clear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate act of encroachment. Across the room, Samuel Porter, Lancaster's lead attorney, finally shifted forward, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He had been lounging comfortably before, but now with the stark evidence on display, he straightened in his seat, scanning the images with growing concern. He cleared his throat, preparing to interject, but Clint didn't give him the opportunity. Reaching into his file once more, Clint pulled out a stack of legal documents, certified copies of zoning laws, property deeds, and permit restrictions. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the judge's bench, setting the documents down in front of Judge Thomas Whitmore, who had, up until this point, maintained an air of detached amusement. That detachment was now gone. Whitmore leaned forward, flipping through the papers, his brow furrowing slightly. "These are official records," Clint continued, his tone even. "They outline the exact parameters of my property, the boundaries I have respected for over 3 decades. He glanced toward the defense table where Lancaster's smirk had thinned into a tight, unreadable line. "Mr. Lancaster's permits," Clint continued, "did not at any point grant him legal access to my land." The silence was thick now. Porter, sensing the need to reassert control, stood adjusting his tie with forced composure. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth but slightly strained, Mr. Eastwood is presenting these documents as if land disputes are as black and white as a film reel. In reality, property law is complex. Boundaries shift, records can be misinterpreted, and misunderstandings happen all the time. Clint turned his head slightly, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Porter's with the kind of gaze that had once made outlaws in spaghetti westerns rethink their choices. "A misunderstanding?" Clint repeated, his voice edged with quiet authority. With slow precision, he flipped through the documents until he found what he was looking for, a cease and desist letter dated months before Lancaster's development had broken ground. He held it up for the court to see. "This was my first warning," he said. It was ignored. He flipped to the next page. Another notice. Ignored. Then another. And another. 4 separate legal notices, Clint continued, setting each document down one by one, all informing Mr. Lancaster that he was in violation of property laws, 4 chances to do the right thing. Porter exhaled sharply, his once confident demeanor beginning to show signs of strain. Lancaster, on the other hand, wasn't even trying to hide his frustration anymore. His fingers tapped against the defense table, his jaw tight, his posture rigid. He had expected Clint Eastwood to stumble, to flounder, to struggle through the technicalities of the law. Instead, Clint was dismantling him piece by piece, with the calm precision of a man who had spent his life standing his ground. The judge, still flipping through the documents, finally looked up, his gaze shifting toward the defense table. There was no amusement in his expression anymore. Clint let the silence stretch, then turned toward the jury, speaking not with theatrics, but with the clarity of someone who had seen too many people get away with too much for too long. "The law isn't complicated," he said simply. "It's only complicated when people think they're above it." And with that, he returned to his seat, the weight of his evidence and his words settling over the courtroom like a storm cloud waiting to break. The tension in the Santa Barbara County Courthouse was thick, like the silence before a storm. Clint Eastwood had just finished laying out his case, a mountain of undeniable evidence that Richard Lancaster had encroached on his land, ignored legal warnings, and operated under the assumption that no one would challenge him. The laughter that had filled the courtroom earlier was long gone. In its place, a weighted quiet settled over the room, as if everyone present was beginning to grasp what was truly at stake. Across the room, Lancaster sat rigid in his chair, his once smug expression now a mask of barely restrained irritation. His attorney, Samuel Porter, leaned in close, whispering something that only his client could hear, but whatever he said, it did little to calm the growing unease in Lancaster's eyes. Porter was a skilled litigator, a man who had built his career on maneuvering his way out of tight corners, but even he was beginning to recognize that this was no ordinary courtroom battle. Then Clint did something unexpected. He called a witness. There was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of surprise from both the judge and the defense, as Clint turned toward the back of the courtroom and said, "I'd like to call Mark Dillard to the stand." A murmur spread through the gallery. No one had heard this name before, not in the pre-trial hearings, not in any of the legal briefings, not even in the media speculation surrounding the case. Lancaster's eyes narrowed, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair just a little tighter. Porter immediately stood, smoothing down the front of his expensive suit. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "Mr. Dillard is not on the official witness list. The defense has not been given prior notice of his testimony, and Judge Thomas Whitmore, who had been silently observing the proceedings with increasing interest, lifted a hand. "Let's hear what Mr. Eastwood has to say," he said, glancing toward Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, who is Mark Dillard?" Clint turned back toward the courtroom doors, and as if on cue, they swung open. A man stepped inside. Mark Dillard was in his early 50s, his work jacket worn, his jeans faded from years of labor under the sun. He had the kind of build that suggested a lifetime of hard work. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, a presence that spoke of experience. But what stood out most was not his appearance. It was the look in his eyes. There was hesitation there, but also something else. Resolve. Lancaster shifted in his seat. Dillard made his way toward the witness stand, the sound of his boots scuffing against the polished wood floor as he moved. He raised his right hand, took the oath, and sat down, exhaling slowly. The courtroom watched in silence, everyone leaning forward as waiting. Clint approached, his hands in his pockets, his voice steady. "Mr. Dillard, could you tell the court what you do for a living?" Dillard cleared his throat, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. "I'm a construction foreman, been in the business for over 20 years. "And who have you worked for recently?" There was the briefest pause. Then Dillard said, "Lancaster Development." If there had been a murmur before, now there was a wave of hushed whispers. The name alone sent a ripple through the courtroom. A man who had worked directly for Richard Lancaster was now sitting in the witness stand, called not by the defense, but by Clint Eastwood himself. Porter's expression darkened, his polished confidence beginning to fray at the edges. He knew what was coming. Clint gave a small nod, glancing briefly at the jury before returning his attention to the witness. "Mr. Dillard, in your time working for Lancaster Development, were you involved in the construction project that extended onto my land?" Dillard exhaled through his nose, shifting slightly in his seat. He hesitated. Then he did something that changed the entire course of the trial. He told the truth. "Yes," Dillard said, his voice firm. "I was there when it happened. I saw the plans. I knew." For a second, the courtroom was so quiet that even the distant sound of a car passing outside could be heard. Porter immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor." But before he could finish, Dillard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. He held it up for the court to see. "I kept records," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Blueprints, emails. There were 2 sets of plans, one that was filed legally and another that showed the actual expansion plans. The second one, the one that extended onto Mr. Eastwood's land, that wasn't supposed to be seen." The reaction was immediate. Lancaster's face went pale. His hands, which had been resting on the table, curled into fists. His once casual posture had turned rigid, his shoulders squared, his jaw tight. Porter, standing beside him, looked like a man who had just realized the chessboard had been flipped. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Dillard, are you saying that Mr. Lancaster knowingly approved construction on land that did not belong to him?" Dillard nodded. "Yes, sir. He knew. We all knew." Clint turned, this time not toward Dillard, but toward Lancaster himself. For the first time since the trial had begun, Richard Lancaster refused to meet his gaze. The air in the courtroom had changed. What had started as a case that many dismissed as a vanity project, a Hollywood star-playing lawyer, had just become something else entirely. This wasn't just about property disputes anymore. This was about deception. This was about fraud. This was about justice. And Clint Eastwood was winning. For the first time since the trial had begun, Richard Lancaster's smirk faded. The ease with which he had lounged in his chair, exchanging quiet remarks with his attorney, was gone. His fingers, which had once tapped lazily against the polished wood of the defense table, now curled into a tense fist. The weight of the evidence presented by Clint Eastwood, photographs, zoning records, cease and desist notices, was impossible to ignore. He had walked into this courtroom believing that his money, his influence, and his team of high-powered attorneys would make this case a simple formality. He had underestimated the man sitting across from him. Across the room, Samuel Porter, Lancaster's lead attorney, tried to maintain his composure. He was still seated, though his body language had shifted. His arms were no longer crossed in casual confidence, but resting tensely on the table, his fingers gripping the edges of his legal pad just a little too tightly. The well-rehearsed air of superiority he had carried at the start of the trial had thinned, replaced by something resembling uncertainty. He was watching the jury now, gauging their reactions, realizing that the mood in the courtroom had changed. What had begun as an amusing spectacle, a Hollywood actor playing lawyer, was now something much more dangerous. Judge Thomas Whitmore, no longer smirking, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses as he flipped through the stack of legal documents Clint had placed before him. He had been skeptical at first, amused even, but the methodical way Clint had presented his case, the undeniable clarity of the evidence, had erased any assumptions he had carried into this trial. This wasn't a man grasping at legal straws, relying on charisma to carry him through. This was a man who had come prepared. And now even the judge could see that. Clint, meanwhile, remained calm, composed, and completely unshaken. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply sat, hands folded in front of him, watching. He had always known this moment would come. The moment when the weight of the truth would begin pressing down on the defense, when the easy confidence of wealth and power would be replaced with something far more fragile. He had seen it happen on screen, but today it was happening in real life. Porter, clearing his throat, finally spoke. "Your Honor," he said, standing, his voice measured but lacking its former edge. "While Mr. Eastwood's presentation is certainly compelling, property law is not always as clear-cut as he suggests." He turned, gesturing toward the jury with a controlled smile. "Boundaries shift, documents can be misinterpreted, and development projects are often subject to unforeseen complications. This is not a case of deliberate wrongdoing, but rather a misunderstanding, one that my client has every intention of addressing fairly." Clint tilted his head slightly, watching Porter work, knowing exactly what he was trying to do: deflect, reframe, soften the damage. It was a textbook legal maneuver, one that had likely worked for Porter in countless other cases, but not this time. Clint leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice, quiet but firm, cut through the courtroom like a blade. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Tell me, Mr. Porter, how many misunderstandings does it take before a man's land is stolen right out from under him?" Porter stiffened. Clint didn't give him time to recover. He reached for the stack of legal notices he had presented earlier and tapped the first page. One ignored notice could be a mistake, maybe even two, but four? Over the course of months? He let that sink in before looking directly at Lancaster. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice." The courtroom remained silent. Lancaster's fingers tightened into fists, his knuckles turning white. He was no longer just defending his case. He was defending his reputation. He had built an empire on his ability to maneuver around regulations, to exploit loopholes, to push boundaries just far enough that no one could stop him. But today he had run into a boundary that would not move. Judge Whitmore exhaled through his nose and turned to Porter. "Mr. Porter, do you have any further comments before we proceed?" Porter hesitated. For the first time in the trial, he had nothing to say. And just like that, Lancaster's confidence, so effortless, so unshakable, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The air in the courtroom had shifted. What had started as an amusing spectacle, an aging Hollywood actor attempting to represent himself, had transformed into something entirely different. The mood was no longer one of lighthearted curiosity or quiet condescension. Now it was heavy with realization, with the weight of undeniable truth. The jury, once relaxed and even entertained by the proceedings, sat upright, their faces serious, their eyes flicking between Clint Eastwood, Judge Whitmore, and the defense table, where Richard Lancaster's once arrogant demeanor had soured into something far less certain. Even the gallery had gone still. Spectators no longer murmuring among themselves, no longer waiting for a laughable misstep from the so-called Hollywood cowboy. Across the room, Samuel Porter, Lancaster's lead attorney, was struggling to regain control. He had spent his career dismantling cases like this, reframing narratives to suit his wealthy clients, turning clear violations into nothing more than misunderstandings wrapped in legal jargon. But now, with Clint Eastwood calmly dismantling his defense piece by piece, Porter was out of tools. The jury wasn't just listening to Clint, they were believing him. Porter knew that once a jury believed a plaintiff, the case was all but lost. He had to act quickly. Clearing his throat, Porter adjusted his tie and stepped toward the jury, his polished voice smooth but slightly strained. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "while Mr. Eastwood has presented a compelling case, let's not forget the complexities of property law. It is rarely as black and white as a photograph or a single legal notice." He gestured toward the evidence Clint had laid out, photographs of the land before and after construction, official zoning laws, written notices that had been ignored. Disputes like this happen all the time, and yes, mistakes were made. But we must ask ourselves, was there criminal intent or simply a miscommunication? Clint, still seated at the plaintiff's table, watched Porter carefully. He recognized the maneuver immediately. Porter was trying to soften the reality of what had been done, trying to turn clear violations into something vague, something that reasonable doubt could latch onto. Clint had seen this tactic in the movies, but today he wasn't playing a role. As Porter finished his speech and walked back to the defense table, Clint slowly rose to his feet. He didn't move quickly, didn't rush, didn't react emotionally. Instead, he did what he had done throughout the entire trial. He took his time. He let the room settle, let the weight of Porter's words hang in the air just long enough that the jury truly had to consider them. Then finally, he spoke. "You know," Clint began, his voice steady, rich with the kind of authority that came from decades of experience. "I've been in a lot of movies over the years." A slight chuckle rippled through the gallery, not of mockery, but of familiarity. Clint let it pass before continuing. "But not a single one of them was about letting people get away with what they knew was wrong." Silence. He took a slow step forward, looking directly at the jury, not at the judge, not at Porter, not even at Lancaster's. His gaze was for them and them alone. Mr. Lancaster knew what he was doing. His voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It was calm, firm, unshakable. "He thought I wouldn't fight back. He thought I'd take a payout, like all the others before me. He thought he could steal a piece of my land, turn it into luxury condos, and walk away richer for it." He let that hang in the air for a moment. Then he took another step forward. "But that's not how justice works." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The jury members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable but focused. They were listening. They were feeling it. Clint turned slightly, finally allowing his gaze to land on Lancaster, whose jaw was clenched so tight his teeth might crack. Mr. Lancaster didn't misunderstand the law. He ignored it. Clint let his words sink in before turning back to the jury. "You're here today because justice isn't about money." His voice was softer now, but no less powerful. "It isn't about how expensive your lawyer is. It isn't about who owns the most land or who has the biggest connections. It's about doing what's right." He exhaled slowly, glancing at Judge Whitmore, who was watching him with an expression Clint hadn't seen before. Not amusement, not condescension, but respect. Finally, Clint nodded, "And that's all I have to say." With that, he walked back to his seat, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the courtroom. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. Then slowly, Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses, took a breath, and turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice measured, "you now have the case." He raised his gavel and brought it down with a sharp, resounding crack. "Court is adjourned until the jury reaches a verdict." As the courtroom erupted into murmurs and quiet discussions, Clint remained seated, his expression unreadable. He had done his part. Now it was up to the jury. and judging by the look on Lancaster's face, he already knew how this was going to end. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and every passing minute only heightened the anticipation in the air. Spectators whispered among themselves, reporters checked their watches, and even Judge Thomas Whitmore, a man known for his patience, tapped his fingers lightly against the bench. At the defense table, Richard Lancaster sat rigid, his once arrogant confidence completely stripped away. His polished veneer of control had cracked, revealing the stark reality of a man who had spent his entire career bending the law to his will, and who had, for the first time, been caught. Across from him, Clint Eastwood remained composed, seated at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He had barely moved since the jury had left the room, his demeanor as calm and steady as it had been throughout the entire trial. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't restless. He was waiting, the same way he had waited through decades of battles, on screen and off. He had presented the facts, laid out the truth, and now it was up to 12 ordinary citizens to decide what happened next. Then, at long last, the side door to the courtroom creaked open. The bailiff stepped inside, his face expressionless as he nodded toward the judge. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict." Silence. Everyone in the room stood as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable, their movements careful. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a steady presence, carried a manila envelope in her hands as she approached the bench. She handed it to Judge Whitmore, who took it without a word. The room was so quiet that the sound of him breaking the seal and unfolding the paper seemed almost deafening. For a moment, he simply read, his expression betraying nothing. Then he looked up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice even, "the jury has returned with a verdict. Please be seated." The room fell back into their chairs, but no one truly relaxed. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the judge as he cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and finally read aloud the decision that would determine everything. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Clint Eastwood." A stunned silence followed. "We find that the defendant, Richard Lancaster, and Lancaster Development Corporation have knowingly encroached upon the plaintiff's property and have acted in bad faith by ignoring repeated legal notices. The court awards the plaintiff full compensation for the damages incurred, as well as additional punitive damages for the defendant's willful disregard of property law. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room erupted. Reporters scrambled to write down every word, some rushing for the exits to be the first to broadcast the decision. Spectators murmured in hushed excitement, some even nodding in approval, as if justice had, at last, been properly served. Across the room, Porter's face was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw and the stiffness of his shoulders told the whole story. He had lost, and he knew it. At the defense table, Lancaster sat frozen. The color had drained from his face, and for the first time, he looked utterly, completely powerless. The empire he had built on loopholes, intimidation, and quiet backroom deals had just suffered a crushing blow, and the man who had dealt it wasn't a politician or a high-powered attorney. It was a 94-year-old actor who had refused to be bullied. Judge Whitmore turned his gaze toward Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, would you like to make a statement before we conclude today's proceedings?" Slowly, Clint stood. He didn't rush, didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply adjusted his jacket, exhaled softly, and looked toward the jury, the people who had just ensured that the law had done what it was meant to do. "I've spent a lot of time in courts," he said, his voice steady. "On screen, of course." A few chuckles rippled through the room, but they quickly faded as he continued. "But this time, I wasn't playing a role. I wasn't acting. I was standing up for what's right. He turned slightly, his gaze landing on Lancaster. Mr. Lancaster took my land, and he thought he could get away with it. He thought he could ignore the law, silence the truth, and walk away with no consequences. His eyes flicked back toward the jury. But today, you made sure that justice prevailed. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Clint gave a small nod, a quiet but unmistakable gesture of gratitude toward the jury, toward the court, toward the system that had today worked as it was meant to. Then he turned back to the judge. "No further comments, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore nodded solemnly. "The court acknowledges the verdict. The defendant is hereby ordered to pay the awarded damages in full, as well as the legal fees of the plaintiff." He raised his gavel. "Court is adjourned." The sharp crack of wood against wood rang through the courtroom as the gavel came down. The decision was final. The fight was over, and Clint Eastwood had won. The moment Judge Whitmore's gavel struck the bench, signaling the final decision, the courtroom erupted into a frenzy of movement and noise. Reporters rushed toward the exits, eager to be the first to break the story. Spectators murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding with quiet approval. Justice had been served, but for many, it wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moment that proved integrity could still stand against power. At the defense table, Richard Lancaster sat motionless, his face pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as if trying to ground himself in reality. Moments earlier, he had been a man of unchecked confidence, someone who had walked into the courtroom expecting to leave unscathed, his wealth and influence shielding him as they always had. Now he was nothing more than a defeated businessman with a ruined reputation and a multi-million-dollar judgment hanging over his head. The weight of it all was evident in his posture. Shoulders slumped, jaw clenched, eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. His attorney, Samuel Porter, was equally rattled. He had built his career on turning unfavorable cases around, on spinning even the most damning evidence into something palatable for a jury. But today, there had been no loopholes, no clever reframing of the facts, just the truth, delivered in a way that no one could deny. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head before muttering something to Lancaster, who barely seemed to hear him. They had lost, and there was no amount of legal maneuvering that could undo what had just happened. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood remained seated at the plaintiff's table, unmoving. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't gloating. He simply sat with his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. This wasn't a victory about money, and it had never been about ego. It was about something far bigger, proving that the law still meant something, that a man's land couldn't just be taken because someone wealthier decided it should be. As the room slowly emptied, a reporter from a national news outlet approached him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, voice eager, "can you tell us how you're feeling after this landmark decision?" Clint turned his gaze toward her, his blue eyes sharp but calm. He took a breath before answering, his voice as steady as it had been throughout the trial. "Justice was served today," he said simply. "Not because I'm Clint Eastwood, not because I was the loudest voice in the room, but because the truth was on my side." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes furiously. Another journalist jumped in, camera rolling. "Do you have anything to say to Mr. Lancaster?" Clint exhaled, glancing toward the defense table where Lancaster and Porter were gathering their papers in silence, their movements stiff and mechanical. "I don't think he needs to hear anything from me." Clint said, his tone even, almost sympathetic. "I think today spoke for itself." With that, he adjusted his jacket, nodded politely to the judge, and turned toward the doors. As he walked, the crowd parted for him, not because he had demanded space, but because they recognized the weight of what had just happened. He had walked into this courtroom as a man many had underestimated. He was walking out as a man who had reminded the world that some fights were worth having, no matter the odds. Outside the courthouse, the California sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the steps. Clint stepped outside, taking in the crisp evening air. The world felt different, though he knew it hadn't changed. The fight for fairness, for justice, for honesty, it was never ending. But today, at least, the right side had won. As he stood there, looking out over the crowd of reporters and onlookers, Judge Whitmore emerged from the courthouse behind him. The older man hesitated, then stepped forward, stopping beside Clint. For a moment neither spoke. Then, with a quiet sigh, Whitmore extended his hand. "I misjudged you, Mr. Eastwood," he admitted, his voice laced with something that almost sounded like admiration. "Not every man would have fought like this." Clint glanced at him, then at the outstretched hand. Slowly he reached out and shook it. "Not every fight is worth it," Clint said simply, "but this one was." With that he turned, stepping down the courthouse steps, walking toward the place that had always mattered most, his land, his home, and the quiet certainty that he had done what was right. The sun hung low over Santa Barbara County Courthouse, casting golden light across the historic stone facade as Clint Eastwood stepped onto the courthouse steps. The heat of the California afternoon had begun to wane, replaced by the crispness of the approaching evening. A crowd had gathered outside, reporters, legal analysts, and everyday citizens, all eager to witness the man who had just taken on a corporate giant and won. The murmur of voices buzzed like a distant echo, the energy electric, but Clint hardly paid attention to the commotion. He had never been one for spectacle. Behind him, the heavy oak doors of the courthouse creaked open once more. The sound was unmistakable, authoritative, final. Judge Thomas Whitmore emerged, pausing at the top of the steps, his silhouette framed against the fading light. He was a man who had spent decades on the bench, accustomed to presiding over high-stakes cases. Yet something about this one had been different. Something about Clint had been different. For a long moment, Whitmore simply observed the scene before him. The crowd, the press, the way people looked at Eastwood not as an actor, but as a man who had stood his ground and proven his case. The judge inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly, his expression thoughtful. Then, with measured steps, he descended the courthouse stairs, closing the distance between them. Clint, sensing the movement, turned slightly, his sharp blue eyes meeting Whitmore's. Neither man spoke right away. There was no need for words, not yet. Instead, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had transpired in the courtroom. The battle had been fought, and justice had been served. Finally, Whitmore broke the silence. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice steady but lacking the humor it had carried when the trial first began. "I misjudged you." It was a rare admission, especially from a man who had spent his life in a position of authority. Judges weren't meant to be swayed by first impressions, yet even he had assumed that Clint was nothing more than an aging actor playing at law. He had smirked at the idea of a Hollywood cowboy arguing property rights, had expected the trial to be an exercise in futility, yet Clint had proven him wrong in every possible way. Clint studied him for a moment, then gave a slight nod. He had nothing to prove, not anymore. But he recognized the weight of the judge's words. Whitmore hesitated for only a fraction of a second before extending his hand. It was a gesture of respect, not as a judge to a plaintiff, but as one man to another. For a brief moment, Clint simply looked at the outstretched hand. Then, with the same deliberate ease he had carried throughout the trial, he reached forward and shook it. The handshake was firm, strong, not the grip of two men exchanging pleasantries, but of two individuals who had, in their own way, tested each other and found a measure of mutual understanding. Not every man would have fought like this, Whitmore admitted, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Most would have settled, taken the easy way out. Clint exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a moment toward the horizon before returning to the judge. "Not every fight is worth it," he said, "but this one was." Whitmore nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. Justice wasn't just about laws and verdicts. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds weren't in your favor. Behind them, the reporters had taken notice of the exchange, cameras clicking, microphones shifting forward, eager to catch whatever words were being spoken. But neither man paid them any mind. This wasn't for the cameras. This wasn't about headlines. This was about something far greater: respect. After a moment, Whitmore stepped back, giving Clint one last nod before turning and making his way back toward the courthouse. His job was done, the case closed, but the lesson he had learned in that courtroom today would stay with him long after the papers were filed away. Clint watched him go, then turned back to the crowd. He had no interest in giving a press conference, no interest in reliving every detail of the trial for the sake of television sound bites. The people had seen what had happened. They knew the truth, and that was enough. As the reporters began shouting questions, eager for one last statement, Clint simply adjusted his jacket, tipped his head slightly, and started walking. The crowd parted for him instinctively, some watching with admiration, others murmuring in quiet respect. A younger man, maybe in his early 30s, stepped forward as Clint passed. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, it's good to know there are still men like you out there." Clint paused briefly, looking at the young man, someone from a different generation, someone who had grown up in a world where values like honor, integrity, and personal responsibility seemed increasingly rare. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of Clint's lips. "There are more of us than you think," he replied. And with that, he continued down the courthouse steps, disappearing into the fading light, leaving behind not just a legal victory, but a reminder that some fights were still worth having. The sun was setting over Santa Barbara County, casting a golden glow across the rolling hills and the stretch of land that had been at the center of the courtroom battle. The air carried the faint scent of salt from the Pacific, mixing with the earthiness of the old oak trees that dotted the landscape. Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of his reclaimed property, hands resting on his hips, gazing out over the land that was his once more. There was no crowd here, no reporters, no flashing cameras, just silence, the kind of peaceful quiet that a man could only truly appreciate after standing his ground and winning a fight worth having. Behind him, the courthouse was barely visible in the distance, just a small structure against the vast expanse of sky. The weight of the trial was behind him now. The judgment had been handed down, the verdict rendered, and Lancaster's empire, built on arrogance and greed, had begun to crumble under the force of truth. The media would continue their coverage, no doubt spinning the case into headlines and sound bites. But for Clint, this moment wasn't about the spectacle. It was about something far simpler. It was about standing on his land, knowing it was still his because he had refused to be pushed aside. As he exhaled, the wind shifted, rustling the dry grass and carrying with it the distant cry of a hawk. It was the kind of moment that called for reflection, and Clint, never one to shy away from his own thoughts, allowed himself that luxury. He thought about how close he had come to losing this land, to having it stolen out from under him by a man who had assumed his power and wealth would protect him. Lancaster had thought he could build over Clint Eastwood's legacy, the same way he had done to so many before him, quietly, efficiently, without resistance. But he had been wrong. Clint had spent his life playing men who stood for justice, who didn't back down when the odds were against them. And yet in that courtroom, he hadn't been playing a role. He had simply done what was right. Not because it was easy, not because it was glamorous, but because there were some things a man shouldn't walk away from. A noise behind him made him turn. An old friend, David Callahan, stood a few yards away, leaning against the worn wooden fence that marked the boundary of Clint's land. David had been a local rancher for decades, a man who had seen too many neighbors lose their land to greedy developers with deep pockets. He had watched this case unfold from the sidelines, silently rooting for Clint every step of the way. David tipped his hat, his weathered face creased with a knowing smile. Well, you did it, he said, his voice rough with age but steady with admiration. Didn't let that snake take what was yours. Clint chuckled softly, shaking his head. Never was much for rolling over. David nodded, stepping closer, his boots crunching against the dry earth. Most folks would have just taken the settlement and walked away. He glanced over at the land, then back at Clint. But not you. Clint met his gaze, his expression unreadable at first. Then after a moment he spoke. There comes a time when a man has to decide what he stands for. And if he lets the wrong people push him around once, they'll do it again. He exhaled slowly. I wasn't about to let that happen. David nodded again, the respect in his eyes clear. Damn right. For a while, neither man spoke. They just stood there, two old friends looking out over a piece of land that, in some ways, represented more than just ownership. It represented principle, resilience, and the belief that some things are worth fighting for. Eventually, David cleared his throat, shifting slightly. Well, I imagine folks in town will be talking about this for a long time. Clint smirked slightly. Let 'em talk. David laughed, shaking his head. Reckon they will. As the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, Clint turned back toward his home. The battle was over, but the land was still here, still his, untouched by Lancaster's greed. And that, more than anything, made the fight worth it. As he walked toward the front porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath his boots, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. Not the fleeting kind that came from a temporary victory, but the lasting kind that came from knowing a man had done the right thing. He paused at the door, glancing back one last time at the man stretching out before him. It wasn't just dirt and grass. It was a part of him, a part of his legacy, and no one, not Lancaster, not anyone, would ever take it from him. With that, Clint Eastwood stepped inside, shutting the door behind him, leaving the world to talk about the legend he had just become once again. In a world where power and wealth often seem to dictate the rules, Clint Eastwood's courtroom battle reminds us that integrity, resilience, and standing up for what's right still matter. His victory wasn't just about land, it was about principle, about proving that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, is above the law. Too often, people choose the easy way out, accepting injustice because fighting back seems too difficult. But as Clint showed, some battles are worth the struggle. Age, status, or the odds stacked against you don't define your strength. Your refusal to back down does. For older generations, this lesson runs deep. We've seen the world change, watched values shift, and witnessed people forget the importance of standing their ground. But wisdom comes with experience, and experience teaches us that doing the right thing never goes out of style. Whether it's protecting what's yours, standing up for someone who can't, or refusing to let the truth be buried, your voice, your actions, and your courage matter. So after hearing this story, ask yourself, have you ever had to fight for something you knew was right, even when the odds were against you? Share your thoughts, because sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from those who've walked the longest roads.